Question 1. Performance analysis shows that a local forestry cooperative is facing significant financial strain due to a recent downturn in timber prices, leading to pressure from its members to increase harvest volumes beyond sustainable limits to meet immediate income needs. The cooperative operates under national forestry regulations that strictly define annual harvesting quotas and mandate specific reforestation timelines to ensure long-term forest health and productivity. Which approach best aligns with the professional and regulatory obligations of the cooperative's management? Option A. Seek emergency funding or explore alternative, non-timber forest product revenue streams while strictly adhering to all national forestry regulations regarding harvest quotas and reforestation. Option B. Reduce reforestation efforts to allocate more resources towards immediate timber extraction and sales, arguing that economic survival is paramount. Option C. Immediately increase harvest volumes to meet member demands, temporarily disregarding the sustainable harvesting quotas to generate necessary funds. Option D. Negotiate with regulatory bodies to permanently increase the sustainable harvest quota based on current economic pressures, even if it means compromising long-term ecological goals. Correct answer is C. Immediately increase harvest volumes to meet member demands, temporarily disregarding the sustainable harvesting quotas to generate necessary funds. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures faced by a forestry cooperative with the long-term sustainability goals mandated by national forestry regulations. The cooperative's members, who are also stakeholders, are experiencing financial hardship, creating a conflict between short-term financial needs and the legally binding requirements for sustainable forest management. Careful judgment is required to navigate this conflict without violating regulatory frameworks. The correct approach involves prioritizing compliance with the national forestry regulations regarding sustainable harvesting quotas and reforestation timelines. This approach is right because it upholds the legal obligations of the cooperative and ensures the long-term health and productivity of the forest resources, which ultimately benefits all stakeholders, including future generations. Adhering to these regulations demonstrates professional integrity and a commitment to responsible resource management, as stipulated by the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam's implied regulatory context, which emphasizes environmental stewardship and legal compliance. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing immediate timber sales to alleviate financial distress is ethically and legally flawed. This would likely lead to exceeding sustainable harvesting quotas, potentially causing irreversible damage to the forest ecosystem, violating national forestry laws, and jeopardizing the long-term viability of the cooperative. Another incorrect approach, which involves delaying reforestation efforts to save immediate costs, also violates regulatory requirements for timely regeneration and ecological restoration, leading to potential penalties and long-term degradation of forest resources. A third incorrect approach, which involves misrepresenting harvest volumes to regulatory bodies, constitutes fraud and a severe breach of trust and legal duty, carrying significant legal repercussions. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable national forestry regulations and their implications. This should be followed by an assessment of the cooperative's financial situation and the root causes of the hardship. The next step involves exploring all legally permissible options for financial relief or operational adjustments that do not compromise regulatory compliance. Open communication with regulatory bodies and stakeholders, including cooperative members, about challenges and potential solutions is crucial. If financial pressures necessitate difficult decisions, the framework should guide towards solutions that minimize regulatory and environmental impact, prioritizing long-term sustainability over short-term gains. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of soil erosion and a high potential impact on downstream water quality if current land management practices on a cooperative farm are continued. The cooperative is facing financial pressure and is considering delaying investments in soil conservation measures to cut immediate costs, which approach best aligns with the principles likely emphasized in the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam's regulatory framework. Option A. Conduct a superficial assessment of erosion risk and implement minimal, low-cost interventions that do not significantly alter current farming operations. Option B, postpone soil conservation investments until financial conditions improve, focusing on maximizing short-term crop yields to generate immediate revenue. Option C, lobby for changes in environmental regulations to allow for more flexible land management practices that prioritize immediate economic benefits for farmers. Option D, implement immediate, albeit potentially costly, soil conservation measures and explore grant opportunities to offset expenses, prioritizing long-term environmental health and regulatory compliance. The correct answer is D, implement immediate, albeit potentially costly, soil conservation measures and explore grant opportunities to offset expenses, prioritizing long-term environmental health and regulatory compliance. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures of a farming cooperative with the long-term sustainability and regulatory compliance mandated by agricultural and forestry laws. The cooperative's members, driven by immediate financial needs, may overlook or downplay environmental risks, creating a conflict between short-term gain and long-term ecological health and legal obligations. Careful judgment is required to integrate economic realities with the stringent requirements of the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam's regulatory framework, which prioritizes sustainable practices and adherence to environmental protection laws. The correct approach involves prioritizing the identification and mitigation of risks that pose the greatest threat to environmental sustainability and regulatory compliance, even if they require upfront investment or temporary operational adjustments. This aligns with the core principles of responsible agricultural and forestry management, which are implicitly tested in the entrance exam. Specifically, it requires a proactive stance in addressing potential soil degradation, water contamination, or biodiversity loss, as these are often central concerns in agricultural and forestry regulations. The justification lies in the exam's presumed emphasis on producing graduates who are not only knowledgeable in agricultural and forestry techniques, but also deeply aware of and committed to their ethical and legal responsibilities towards the environment and the broader community. Adhering to these principles ensures the long-term viability of agricultural enterprises and upholds the reputation of the profession. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without considering environmental impact fails to acknowledge the regulatory framework's emphasis on sustainability. This approach risks noncompliance with environmental protection laws, leading to potential fines, operational disruptions, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes short-term yield increases through potentially unsustainable methods, such as excessive chemical use or land conversion, directly contravenes the principles of responsible resource management that are fundamental to agricultural and forestry education and practice. Such actions can lead to irreversible environmental damage and violate specific regulations designed to prevent these outcomes. A third incorrect approach that dismisses potential risks due to a lack of immediate observable consequences ignores the precautionary principle often embedded in environmental regulations, which mandates proactive risk assessment and management even in the absence of definitive proof of harm. This can lead to unforeseen and severe environmental problems that are far more costly to rectify later. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that integrates risk assessment with regulatory requirements and ethical considerations. This involves systematically identifying potential environmental and operational risks, evaluating their likelihood and impact, and then developing mitigation strategies that are both economically feasible and environmentally sound, while strictly adhering to all applicable laws and guidelines. The process should involve consultation with experts, transparent communication with stakeholders, and a commitment to continuous improvement in sustainable practices. Question 3. The risk matrix shows a high probability of soil erosion and water contamination from current farming practices on the cooperative's land. As an advisor from the Agriculture and Forestry University, you are tasked with recommending a course of action to the cooperative's board, which is composed of farmers with varying economic priorities and environmental awareness. Which of the following recommendations best aligns with the regulatory framework for sustainable agriculture and ethical land stewardship? Option A. Advise the board to disregard the risk matrix as an overly cautious assessment and continue with existing practices, focusing on maximizing short-term yields. Option B. Suggest that the cooperative invest in expensive, unproven new technologies to address the identified risks, without a clear understanding of their efficacy or regulatory approval. Option C. Implement a phased approach to introduce cover cropping and contour plowing, supported by educational workshops for members on their long-term benefits and regulatory compliance. Option D. Advocate for immediate cessation of all practices identified as high risk in the matrix, regardless of the economic impact on members, to ensure absolute compliance. Correct answer is C. Implement a phased approach to introduce cover cropping and contour plowing, supported by educational workshops for members on their long-term benefits and regulatory compliance. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures of a farming cooperative with the long-term environmental sustainability mandated by agricultural regulations. The cooperative's members are stakeholders with differing priorities, and the university's role as an advisor necessitates adherence to both agricultural best practices and relevant legal frameworks. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing interests while ensuring compliance and promoting responsible land management. The correct approach involves prioritizing the long-term health of the soil and water resources, as dictated by the regulatory framework for sustainable agriculture. This means implementing practices that mitigate erosion and pollution, even if they incur initial costs or require changes in traditional farming methods. This approach is ethically sound as it upholds the principle of stewardship over natural resources and legally compliant by adhering to environmental protection laws. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without considering environmental impact fails to meet regulatory requirements for pollution control and soil conservation. This could lead to fines, sanctions, and long-term damage to the land, undermining the cooperative's future viability. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the immediate demands of a single cooperative member over the collective environmental responsibility ignores the broader regulatory obligations and the potential for negative externalities affecting other members and the wider ecosystem. This demonstrates a failure to uphold principles of fairness and environmental accountability. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the risk matrix entirely as an overestimation of potential environmental damage demonstrates a disregard for established risk assessment methodologies and regulatory guidance. This can lead to unpreparedness for environmental incidents and non-compliance with preventative measures mandated by law. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape and the specific risks identified in the risk matrix. This involves consulting relevant legislation, environmental impact assessments, and expert advice. The next step is to evaluate potential solutions against these requirements, considering both economic feasibility and environmental impact. Stakeholder engagement is crucial to understand their concerns and to communicate the rationale behind decisions. Finally, professionals must document their decision-making process and the justification for their chosen course of action, ensuring transparency and accountability. Question 4. System analysis indicates that a land manager responsible for a significant tract of agricultural and forestry land is facing pressure from a timber company to expedite a large-scale logging operation. The land manager is aware that certain areas within the tract are designated as sensitive habitats and are subject to specific reforestation and biodiversity protection regulations, as per the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exams governing framework. Which approach best balances the immediate economic opportunity with the long-term regulatory and ecological responsibilities? Option A. Prioritize the timber company's demands to secure the immediate revenue and only conduct minimal environmental checks to avoid significant delays, with the understanding that future remediation efforts can compensate for any minor breaches. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive stakeholder consultation process, including regulatory bodies, local environmental groups, and community representatives, to develop a logging plan that strictly adheres to all mandated environmental protection and reforestation regulations before any operations commence. Option C. postpone the logging operation indefinitely due to the potential for regulatory complications, thereby avoiding any immediate economic gain, but also any risk of non-compliance. Option D. Proceed with the logging operation as planned by the timber company, assuming their expertise in environmental compliance, and address any potential regulatory issues after the harvest. Correct answer is D. Proceed with the logging operation as planned by the timber company, assuming their expertise in environmental compliance, and address any potential regulatory issues after the harvest. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate economic pressures and the long-term sustainability goals mandated by agricultural and forestry regulations. A land manager must balance the immediate need for revenue from timber harvesting with the regulatory requirements for biodiversity conservation and soil health, which are crucial for the long-term viability of the ecosystem and the agricultural output. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam's specified regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes sustainable land use practices. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder consultation process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and long-term ecological health. This approach is right because it directly addresses the core principles of sustainable land management, as likely outlined in the exam's regulatory framework. By engaging with regulatory bodies, local communities, and environmental groups, the land manager ensures that proposed harvesting plans adhere to all legal requirements concerning protected species, watercourse buffer zones, and reforestation obligations. This proactive engagement minimizes the risk of noncompliance, potential fines, and reputational damage, while also fostering trust and collaboration for future land management decisions. Ethical considerations also strongly support this approach, as it demonstrates a commitment to responsible stewardship of natural resources for present and future generations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term timber revenue without adequate consideration for regulatory stipulations would fail to meet the legal obligations. This would likely involve practices that degrade soil quality, disrupt wildlife habitats, or violate water protection zones, leading to regulatory penalties and environmental damage. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes appeasing a single powerful stakeholder, such as a major timber buyer, over broader regulatory compliance would also be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to decisions that are legally unsound and environmentally detrimental, even if they satisfy immediate commercial interests. A third incorrect approach that relies on outdated or incomplete environmental impact assessments would be flawed, because it fails to incorporate current regulatory standards and scientific understanding, potentially leading to unforeseen negative consequences and noncompliance. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of all applicable regulations and environmental laws. This should be followed by a comprehensive assessment of the ecological and social impacts of any proposed land management activity. Engaging with all relevant stakeholders, including regulatory agencies, local communities, and environmental experts, is crucial for gathering diverse perspectives and ensuring buy-in. Finally, decisions should be made based on a balanced consideration of economic viability, regulatory compliance, and long-term ecological sustainability, with a commitment to transparency and adaptive management. Question 5. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of noncompliance with soil conservation regulations due to current farming practices, potentially impacting the cooperative's eligibility for government subsidies. Which stakeholder perspective should be prioritized when developing mitigation strategies? Option A. The perspective of members who advocate for immediate cost-cutting measures, even if they risk regulatory noncompliance. Option B. The perspective of external auditors who focus solely on financial statements without considering operational compliance. Option C. The perspective of regulatory bodies and environmental scientists, emphasizing long-term land stewardship and legal adherence. Option D. The perspective of consumers demanding cheaper produce, irrespective of the production methods used. The correct answer is A. The perspective of members who advocate for immediate cost-cutting measures, even if they risk regulatory noncompliance. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures of a farming cooperative with the long-term sustainability and regulatory compliance mandated by agricultural and forestry laws. The cooperative's management must consider the diverse interests of its members, the environmental impact of their practices, and the legal framework governing land use and resource management. A failure to adhere to these regulations can result in significant penalties, reputational damage, and loss of operational licenses, impacting all stakeholders. The correct approach involves prioritizing the identification and mitigation of risks that directly contravene the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exams' specified regulatory framework. This means proactively seeking expert advice on compliance, engaging with regulatory bodies to understand specific requirements, and implementing management strategies that align with legal obligations for sustainable land use and resource management. This approach is ethically sound and legally compliant, ensuring the cooperative operates within the bounds of the law and promotes responsible agricultural and forestry practices, thereby safeguarding its future and the environment. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on short-term profit maximization without considering regulatory implications is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the legal framework, potentially leading to environmental degradation, resource depletion, and legal sanctions. Another incorrect approach that involves ignoring potential risks due to a lack of understanding of the regulatory landscape is also flawed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and professional responsibility, as ignorance of the law is not a defense. Finally, an approach that delays or avoids necessary compliance measures due to cost concerns, without exploring compliant alternatives or seeking financial assistance for such measures, represents a failure to uphold professional duties and a potential breach of regulatory requirements. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory framework. This involves risk assessment, identifying potential noncompliance issues, and then developing strategies that are both economically viable and legally sound. Seeking expert legal and technical advice, engaging in transparent communication with stakeholders, and adopting a proactive stance towards compliance are crucial elements of responsible professional practice. Question 6. The risk matrix shows a high probability of soil degradation and water contamination associated with a proposed large-scale monoculture farm in a region known for its biodiversity. Considering the principles of sustainable agriculture and the regulatory framework governing agricultural development in this jurisdiction, which stakeholder perspective should be given the highest priority in the decision-making process for this project? Option A. The perspective of the local farming cooperative advocating for immediate economic returns and increased crop yields. Option B. The perspective of the government agency responsible for ensuring food security and agricultural productivity. Option C. The perspective of the environmental advocacy group highlighting the long-term ecological consequences and the need for biodiversity conservation. Option D. The perspective of the research scientists from the Agriculture and Forestry University, who have provided data on soil health and water quality. Correct answer is A. The perspective of the local farming cooperative advocating for immediate economic returns and increased crop yields. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic benefits of a proposed agricultural project with its potential long-term environmental and social impacts, all within the specific regulatory framework of the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam. The risk matrix, a common tool in project management and environmental impact assessment, highlights potential issues that need careful consideration by stakeholders. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process that prioritizes transparency, data-driven decision-making, and adherence to the principles of sustainable agriculture, as likely outlined in the relevant national or regional agricultural and environmental policies applicable to the exam's jurisdiction. This means actively seeking input from all affected parties, including local communities, environmental groups, agricultural experts, and government agencies, and using this input to inform a decision that aligns with established environmental protection laws and agricultural development guidelines. The justification lies in the ethical imperative to ensure that development projects do not disproportionately harm vulnerable communities or ecosystems, and that they contribute to long-term agricultural sustainability, a core tenet of responsible land management. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the economic gains without adequately addressing the identified environmental risks. This fails to comply with environmental impact assessment regulations that mandate the consideration of ecological consequences and mitigation strategies. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the concerns of local communities, thereby violating principles of social equity and potentially contravening regulations related to community consultation and land rights. Prioritizing the interests of a single stakeholder group, such as large-scale agricultural producers, over the broader public good or environmental integrity would also be a failure, as it neglects the holistic approach required by sustainable development frameworks. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape. This involves identifying all applicable laws, policies, and guidelines related to agriculture, forestry, and environmental protection within the exam's jurisdiction. Next, they must conduct a robust risk assessment, using tools like the risk matrix to identify potential negative impacts. Crucially, this assessment must be followed by a comprehensive stakeholder analysis to understand the concerns and perspectives of all relevant parties. The decision-making process should then involve evaluating potential mitigation strategies for identified risks and engaging in transparent consultation with stakeholders to reach a consensus or a well-justified decision that balances economic viability with environmental and social responsibility, always in compliance with the established legal and ethical standards. Question 7. Investigation of a farmer's request for immediate advice on improving crop yield on a specific plot of land, where the farmer suggests a particular, readily available fertilizer based on a neighbor's success, requires the university's agricultural extension team to consider various response strategies. Which strategy best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical guidelines for agricultural research and extension services? Option A. Advise the farmer to conduct a thorough soil and water sampling of the affected plot for comprehensive laboratory analysis before any fertilizer recommendations are made. Option B. Recommend the immediate application of the fertilizer suggested by the farmer, as it has shown positive results for a neighboring farm and addresses the farmer's urgent need for improved yield. Option C. Rely on the farmer's anecdotal evidence and personal observations of the land's condition to prescribe a suitable amendment. Option D. Suggest a generic, widely used fertilizer that is known to be cost-effective, assuming it will likely provide a general boost to crop growth. The correct answer is B. Recommend the immediate application of the fertilizer suggested by the farmer, as it has shown positive results for a neighboring farm and addresses the farmer's urgent need for improved yield. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate economic pressures and the long-term sustainability of agricultural resources, which are central to the mandate of an agricultural university. The need to balance immediate financial viability for farmers with the university's role in promoting responsible land management and research requires careful judgment. The university, as a stakeholder in the agricultural sector, has a responsibility to ensure its research and recommendations are grounded in sound scientific principles and contribute to the long-term health of the ecosystem. The correct approach involves prioritizing the collection of comprehensive soil and water samples for detailed analysis before making any recommendations. This aligns with the regulatory framework governing agricultural research and extension services, which mandates evidence-based practices. Specifically, it adheres to guidelines that emphasize the importance of accurate data collection for informed decision-making in land management, ensuring that any proposed interventions are scientifically validated and environmentally sound. This approach upholds the university's ethical obligation to provide reliable guidance that promotes sustainable agriculture and protects natural resources for future generations. An incorrect approach that immediately suggests the use of a specific, unverified fertilizer based on anecdotal evidence fails to meet regulatory requirements for scientific rigor. This bypasses the crucial step of data collection and analysis, leading to potentially harmful recommendations that could degrade soil health or contaminate water sources, violating environmental protection laws and ethical guidelines for agricultural research. Another incorrect approach that focuses solely on the perceived immediate cost-effectiveness of a particular input without considering its long-term environmental impact or efficacy is also professionally unacceptable. This overlooks the broader regulatory and ethical considerations of sustainable land use and resource management, potentially leading to practices that are detrimental to the agricultural ecosystem and the university's reputation. A third incorrect approach that relies on the farmer's personal experience and intuition without independent scientific verification ignores the core principles of agricultural science and research. While farmer experience is valuable, it cannot replace the systematic data collection and analysis required by regulatory bodies and ethical standards to ensure the validity and safety of agricultural practices. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, clearly define the problem and the objectives. Second, identify all relevant stakeholders and their perspectives. Third, gather comprehensive, unbiased data through appropriate scientific methods. Fourth, analyze the data rigorously. Fifth, consult relevant regulations, laws, and ethical guidelines. Sixth, develop and evaluate potential solutions based on evidence and best practices. And finally, communicate recommendations clearly and transparently, explaining the rationale and potential implications. Question 8. The efficiency study reveals that the university's extensive forestry holdings are underperforming financially compared to market benchmarks. The university administration is considering several options for these lands, aiming to improve revenue generation while adhering to its mission as an educational and research institution. Which approach best balances financial improvement with responsible land stewardship and regulatory compliance? Option A. Lease a significant portion of the forestry lands to an external agricultural company for the development of intensive, high-yield monoculture crop production, prioritizing immediate rental income. Option B. Authorize immediate clear-cutting of mature timber across the majority of the forestry holdings to maximize immediate revenue, with minimal reforestation efforts focused solely on meeting minimum legal requirements. Option C. Develop and implement a comprehensive, long-term sustainable forestry management plan, incorporating ecological restoration, biodiversity enhancement, and phased timber harvesting, while seeking external validation of the plan's environmental and economic viability. Option D. Postpone any decision regarding the forestry holdings indefinitely, citing the need for further, unspecified studies, and continue with the current, underperforming management practices. The correct answer is C. Develop and implement a comprehensive, long-term sustainable forestry management plan, incorporating ecological restoration, biodiversity enhancement, and phased timber harvesting, while seeking external validation of the plan's environmental and economic viability. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial interests of a university with its long-term ethical obligations to sustainable land management and the broader agricultural community. The university, as a landholder and educational institution, has a dual responsibility to generate revenue from its forestry assets and to serve as a model for responsible environmental stewardship. The pressure to maximize short-term profit can conflict with the principles of sustainable forestry, which often involve longer investment horizons and a consideration of ecological impacts beyond immediate yield. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any decision aligns with the university's mission and adheres to relevant national and local regulations governing land use and environmental protection. The correct approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive, long-term sustainability plan that integrates ecological, economic, and social considerations. This approach is right because it aligns with the principles of responsible land management and the ethical mandate of an academic institution to promote best practices. Specifically, it adheres to the spirit and letter of National Forestry Acts and environmental protection guidelines that emphasize sustainable harvesting, biodiversity conservation, and community engagement. By seeking external expert validation and transparently communicating findings, the university demonstrates a commitment to scientific integrity and public accountability, which are core values for an educational body. An approach that focuses solely on immediate profit maximization by clear-cutting and selling timber without regard for regeneration or ecological impact is ethically and regulatorily flawed. This fails to comply with national forestry regulations that mandate sustainable harvesting practices, reforestation obligations, and environmental impact assessments. Such an approach prioritizes short-term financial gain over long-term ecological health and the university's role as a responsible land steward. An approach that proposes to lease the land for intensive, non-forestry-related agricultural development, such as monoculture crop farming, without considering the impact on the existing forest ecosystem or its potential for sustainable forestry, is also problematic. This disregards environmental protection laws that may govern land use changes and the preservation of natural habitats. It also fails to leverage the university's expertise in forestry and agriculture for sustainable outcomes. An approach that suggests delaying any action indefinitely due to the complexity of the decision, without engaging in any form of assessment or planning, is an abdication of responsibility. While caution is warranted, an action can lead to the degradation of the forest resource and missed opportunities for sustainable management and revenue generation, potentially violating the university's duty to manage its assets effectively and responsibly. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify all stakeholders and their interests, e.g., university administration, forestry department, environmental groups, local community students. 2. Clearly define the objectives, considering both financial and non-financial, e.g., environmental, educational, social goals. 3. Gather comprehensive data including ecological assessments, market analyses, and regulatory requirements. 4. Develop multiple potential strategies, evaluating each against the defined objectives and relevant legal/ethical frameworks. 5. Seek expert advice and conduct stakeholder consultations to refine strategies and ensure buy-in. 6. Select the strategy that best balances competing interests and adheres to all applicable laws and ethical principles, with a clear plan for implementation and monitoring. Question 9. Stakeholder feedback indicates a desire from a prominent local agricultural cooperative to convert a significant portion of protected forest land adjacent to their farms into arable land for increased crop production. As a university researcher tasked with advising on this matter, which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical responsibilities for managing agricultural and forestry resources? Option A. Propose a partial conversion of the land based on an informal discussion with cooperative leaders, without consulting official regulations or conducting an environmental assessment. Option B. Grant the cooperative's request to begin land conversion, assuming their economic needs outweigh the current land designation. Option C. Inform the cooperative that their request cannot be considered due to the protected status of the land, without further investigation into potential regulatory avenues or alternative solutions. Option D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review of national forestry and land use regulations to determine the legal feasibility and environmental impact of such a conversion, consulting with relevant government agencies and environmental experts. The correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a comprehensive review of national forestry and land use regulations to determine the legal feasibility and environmental impact of such a conversion, consulting with relevant government agencies and environmental experts. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a specific stakeholder group with the long-term sustainability and ecological integrity of agricultural and forestry resources, which are governed by specific national regulations. The pressure from a powerful stakeholder group can lead to decisions that prioritize short-term gains over compliance with environmental protection laws and ethical land management practices. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed changes align with the overarching goals of sustainable resource management, as mandated by the agriculture and forestry universities' governing regulations and national environmental policies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of existing national regulations pertaining to land use, environmental impact assessments, and sustainable agricultural practices. This approach is right because it prioritizes adherence to the legal framework established for the sector. Specifically, it necessitates consulting the relevant sections of the national agricultural and forestry laws, which likely outline permissible land use changes, biodiversity protection measures, and requirements for environmental impact studies before any significant alterations to land management can be implemented. This ensures that decisions are legally sound and ethically responsible, safeguarding the long-term health of the ecosystem and the public interest in resource conservation. Incorrect approach is analysis, an approach that immediately agrees to the stakeholders' request without any regulatory review fails to uphold the principles of good governance and environmental stewardship. This is a regulatory failure because it bypasses the legal requirements for land use and environmental protection, potentially leading to illegal activities and ecological damage. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of professional integrity by prioritizing a single stakeholder's demands over broader societal and environmental responsibilities. An approach that dismisses the stakeholders' concerns outright without investigation is also professionally unsound. While it might avoid immediate regulatory breaches, it fails to engage with legitimate feedback and could lead to future conflicts or missed opportunities for improvement within the established regulatory framework. It also neglects the ethical obligation to consider the perspectives of all stakeholders, even if their proposals are not immediately feasible. An approach that proposes a compromise without understanding the full regulatory implications is risky. While compromise is often a valuable tool, doing so without a clear understanding of the legal boundaries can inadvertently lead to non-compliance. This is a regulatory failure because it assumes flexibility where strict rules may apply, and an ethical failure because it could lead to unintended negative consequences for the environment or other stakeholders. Professional reasoning. Professionals in agriculture and forestry must adopt a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant legal and regulatory landscape. This involves identifying all applicable national laws, policies, and guidelines. Next, they should gather information from all relevant stakeholders, assessing their concerns and proposals against the established regulatory framework. Any proposed action must then be evaluated for its compliance with these regulations, including any necessary environmental impact assessments or permits. Finally, decisions should be made based on a balanced consideration of legal requirements, ethical responsibilities, and the long-term sustainability of the resources. Question 10. When evaluating proposals for new agricultural land development in a region with significant biodiversity and a history of traditional farming practices, which stakeholder perspective should be given absolute priority to ensure compliance with the spirit and letter of national agricultural and forestry regulations? Option A. The perspective of potential external investors, focusing on maximizing profitability and return on investment. Option B. The perspective of government regulatory bodies, ensuring adherence to all national environmental and land use laws. Option C. The perspective of environmental conservation groups, prioritizing the preservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Option D. The perspective of local communities, emphasizing their immediate economic needs and traditional land use rights. The correct answer is D. The perspective of local communities, emphasizing their immediate economic needs and traditional land use rights. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic needs of local communities with the long-term sustainability of agricultural and forestry resources, as well as adhering to national and regional environmental protection laws. The university entrance exam for agriculture and forestry necessitates an understanding of how various stakeholders' interests intersect and how to navigate these complexities ethically and legally. The correct approach involves prioritizing the development of sustainable land use plans that integrate community needs with ecological preservation, guided by the principles enshrined in the national agricultural and forestry legislation. This approach is right because it aligns with the core mandate of agricultural and forestry education, to foster practices that ensure both productivity and environmental stewardship for future generations. It acknowledges that true progress in these sectors requires a holistic view, considering social, economic, and environmental factors as mandated by the relevant national laws and university guidelines for responsible resource management. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term economic gains without adequate environmental impact assessments would fail to comply with national environmental protection laws and sustainable development principles. This disregards the long-term health of the ecosystem and the viability of future agricultural and forestry activities. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes external investment over local community involvement and traditional knowledge would violate ethical guidelines concerning equitable development and stakeholder engagement, potentially leading to social conflict and unsustainable practices. It overlooks the importance of community buy-in, which is often implicitly or explicitly supported by regulations promoting local participation in resource management. A third incorrect approach that ignores the regulatory framework entirely and proceeds with development based on personal judgment would be a direct violation of the law and professional conduct, leading to legal repercussions and damage to the reputation of the profession and the institution. Professionals in agriculture and forestry should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant legal and regulatory landscape. This includes identifying all stakeholders and their respective interests, conducting comprehensive environmental and social impact assessments, and engaging in transparent consultation processes. The decision should then be made based on a balanced consideration of economic viability, ecological sustainability, and social equity, always in strict adherence to the established laws and ethical codes. Question 11. The control framework reveals that a farm is experiencing significant pest pressure impacting crop yields. The farm manager is considering several strategies to address this issue, balancing immediate financial constraints with regulatory requirements for sustainable agricultural practices. Which of the following strategies best aligns with the principles of responsible farm management and regulatory compliance within the context of the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam specified framework? Option A. Using a combination of approved pesticides and unregistered, cheaper alternatives to reduce overall expenditure on pest control. Option B. Delaying any intervention, hoping that natural predators will eventually control the pest population without any active management. Option C. Prioritizing the use of the cheapest available chemical pesticides to maximize immediate cost savings and minimize crop loss. Option D. Implementing integrated pest management (IPM) techniques, including biological controls and targeted application of approved pesticides only when necessary. The correct answer is D. Implementing integrated pest management (IPM) techniques, including biological controls and targeted application of approved pesticides only when necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the immediate financial pressures of a farm operation and the long-term sustainability goals mandated by agricultural regulations. The need to balance immediate profitability with environmental stewardship requires careful judgment and adherence to established guidelines. The correct approach involves prioritizing the implementation of integrated pest management (IPM) strategies. This is the most professionally sound choice because it directly aligns with the principles of sustainable agriculture and the regulatory framework governing pesticide use, which emphasizes minimizing environmental impact and promoting biodiversity. IPM strategies, by their nature, are designed to be cost-effective in the long run by reducing reliance on expensive chemical inputs and preventing the development of pesticide resistance, thereby ensuring the continued viability of the farm's output. Adhering to these principles demonstrates a commitment to responsible land management and compliance with the spirit and letter of agricultural regulations. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate cost savings of using cheaper, less regulated pesticides. This fails to acknowledge the long-term economic and environmental consequences, such as soil degradation, water contamination, and potential regulatory penalties for non-compliance with environmental protection laws. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the pest problem entirely, hoping it resolves itself. This is professionally irresponsible as it risks significant crop loss, jeopardizing the farm's economic stability and potentially violating regulations that require proactive management of agricultural threats. Finally, an approach that involves circumventing reporting requirements for pesticide application, even if using approved substances, is a direct violation of regulatory transparency and accountability, exposing the farm to legal repercussions and undermining trust in agricultural practices. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape and its objectives. This should be followed by an assessment of the available management options, evaluating each against both economic feasibility and regulatory compliance, with a strong emphasis on long-term sustainability. Ethical considerations, such as the impact on the environment and public health, should be integrated into this evaluation. When faced with conflicting pressures, prioritizing adherence to regulations and ethical best practices, even if it requires a short-term investment or adjustment, is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and ensuring the long-term success of the agricultural enterprise. Question 12. Analysis of a proposal for a new research project involving genetically modified crops, which promises significant funding from a private agrochemical company, presents a dilemma for the Agriculture and Forestry University. The project requires extensive field trials on university-owned land. Local farming communities have expressed concerns about potential cross-contamination with conventional crops and long-term soil health impacts. The university's internal ethics committee has raised questions about the transparency of the funding source and its potential influence on research outcomes. Considering the university's mandate for sustainable agriculture and responsible research, which approach best navigates these competing interests and adheres to the relevant regulatory framework? Option A. Negotiate a revised research plan that includes rigorous, independent environmental impact assessments, transparent disclosure of funding, and a phased approach to field trials with community consultation and oversight, even if it reduces the immediate funding or delays the project. Option B. Proceed with the research project as proposed, prioritizing the substantial funding and the potential for groundbreaking scientific advancements, while assuring the funding company that all necessary permits will be obtained. Option C. Reject the proposal outright due to the community concerns and the Ethics Committee's reservations, opting for less lucrative but less controversial research avenues. Option D. Accept the funding and proceed with the field trials, focusing solely on the scientific objectives of the research and addressing community concerns only if they escalate to formal complaints. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the research project as proposed, prioritizing the substantial funding and the potential for groundbreaking scientific advancements, while assuring the funding company that all necessary permits will be obtained. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate economic pressures and the long-term sustainability of agricultural resources, which are central to the mandate of an institution like the Agriculture and Forestry University. The university, as a stakeholder, has a responsibility not only to its students and faculty, but also to the broader agricultural community and the environment. Balancing the need for research funding with ethical considerations regarding land use and potential environmental impact requires careful judgment. The correct approach involves prioritizing the long-term ecological health and the ethical implications of research practices over short-term financial gains. This aligns with the principles of sustainable agriculture and responsible land stewardship, which are likely embedded within the regulatory framework governing agricultural research and education in the specified jurisdiction. Specifically, it would adhere to guidelines that mandate environmental impact assessments, ethical review of research proposals, and a commitment to preserving biodiversity and soil health for future generations. This approach upholds the university's role as a custodian of agricultural knowledge and resources. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing immediate research funding without adequate consideration for environmental impact would fail to meet regulatory requirements for environmental protection and ethical research conduct. Such an approach could lead to irreversible ecological damage, reputational harm to the university, and potential legal repercussions for violating environmental laws or research ethics guidelines. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the convenience of external partners over the university's own research integrity and long-term sustainability goals would also be professionally unacceptable. This could involve compromising research protocols or overlooking potential negative externalities to secure a partnership, thereby undermining the core mission of the university and its commitment to objective, ethical research. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the concerns of local farming communities regarding potential environmental risks would disregard the importance of stakeholder engagement and social license to operate. This could lead to community opposition, legal challenges, and a breakdown in trust, hindering the university's ability to conduct research and fulfill its educational mandate effectively. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-stakeholder consultation, a thorough environmental and ethical impact assessment, and a clear adherence to the established regulatory framework and ethical guidelines of the Agriculture and Forestry University. Prioritizing long-term sustainability, ethical conduct, and community well-being over short-term financial expediency is paramount. Question 13. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of prospective students lacking foundational knowledge in sustainable land management practices, a key area for the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam. Considering the university's commitment to producing environmentally conscious professionals, which approach best addresses this risk while adhering to the exam's regulatory framework? Option A. Focus the exam solely on general scientific aptitude, assuming that specific knowledge in sustainable land management can be developed post-admission. Option B. Incorporate a dedicated section within the entrance exam assessing understanding of sustainable land management principles, drawing questions directly from the prescribed syllabus for this topic. Option C. Introduce a mandatory pre-entrance workshop on sustainable land management, making attendance optional for applicants. Option D. Reduce the overall difficulty of the entrance exam to ensure a higher pass rate, assuming that students will acquire necessary knowledge during their studies. Correct answer is B. Incorporate a dedicated section within the entrance exam assessing understanding of sustainable land management principles, drawing questions directly from the prescribed syllabus for this topic. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests within the specific regulatory framework of the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam. The university must consider the perspectives of prospective students, faculty, the institution itself, and potentially the broader agricultural and forestry sectors that will benefit from its graduates. Careful judgment is required to ensure the entrance exam accurately assesses candidates' potential for success in these fields while remaining fair and accessible. The correct approach involves prioritizing the development of assessment criteria that are directly aligned with the core competencies and knowledge expected of students entering agriculture and forestry programs. This means focusing on understanding fundamental scientific principles, problem-solving skills relevant to agricultural and forestry challenges, and an awareness of current industry practices and environmental considerations. This approach is justified by the university's mandate to provide quality education and produce competent professionals. Adhering to the established curriculum, guidelines, and assessment objectives for the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam ensures that the exam serves its intended purpose of identifying suitable candidates and upholding academic standards. An incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the perceived ease of administration or the desire to maximize applicant numbers without regard for the academic rigor required. This could lead to an exam that is too simplistic, failing to differentiate between candidates with genuine aptitude and those who may struggle with the demands of the program. Such an approach would violate the ethical obligation to provide a fair and accurate assessment, and could undermine the reputation of the university and the quality of its graduates. Another incorrect approach would be to introduce assessment components that are not directly related to agricultural or forestry studies, such as general aptitude tests that do not measure specific subject knowledge or skills. This would be a misallocation of resources and would not effectively identify candidates best suited for the specialized fields of study. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough review of the official syllabus and learning outcomes for the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam. They should then consult with faculty members from relevant departments to identify essential knowledge and skills. Stakeholder feedback, particularly from academic staff, should be considered to ensure the assessment is relevant and effective. The process should involve piloting assessment items and seeking expert review to validate their fairness and accuracy, always within the bounds of the exam's stated objectives and regulatory framework. Question 14. The risk matrix shows that soil erosion and water source contamination are high-priority risks for the cooperative's agricultural lands, while minor pest outbreaks are a low-priority risk. The cooperative is facing budget constraints for the upcoming fiscal year, which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework for agricultural and forestry management. Option A. Focus all available funds on immediate pest control to ensure maximum crop yield this season, and postpone any investments in soil and water conservation. Option B. Allocate immediate funding to implement contour plowing and riparian buffer zone restoration to mitigate soil erosion and water contamination, and defer non-essential pest control measures. Option C. Seek external funding specifically for soil and water conservation projects, while using existing budgets solely for operational expenses and minor pest control. Option D. Address the minor pest outbreaks first, as they represent a more immediate threat to current crop production, and revisit soil and water conservation measures in future years. The correct answer is B. Allocate immediate funding to implement contour plowing and riparian buffer zone restoration to mitigate soil erosion and water contamination, and defer non-essential pest control measures. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic pressures of a farming cooperative with the long-term sustainability and regulatory compliance mandated by agricultural and forestry laws. The cooperative's leadership must make decisions that impact not only current profitability, but also the environmental health of the land and the future viability of the enterprise, all while adhering to specific national regulations. The correct approach involves prioritizing the implementation of sustainable land management practices identified as high-priority risks on the matrix. This is ethically and regulatorily justified because national agricultural and forestry laws typically mandate responsible stewardship of natural resources. These laws often require proactive measures to prevent soil erosion, protect water sources, and maintain biodiversity, which are directly addressed by the high-priority risks. Adhering to these regulations ensures the cooperative operates legally, avoids potential fines or sanctions, and secures its long-term operational capacity. Furthermore, it aligns with the ethical duty to preserve the land for future generations. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on short-term cost reduction by neglecting the high-priority risks is professionally unacceptable. This failure would violate regulatory requirements for environmental protection and sustainable land use, potentially leading to legal penalties and reputational damage. It also demonstrates a disregard for the long-term health of the agricultural land, which is the cooperative's primary asset. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes addressing only low-priority risks, despite the matrix highlighting significant threats, is also flawed. This demonstrates poor risk management and a failure to allocate resources effectively to mitigate the most critical issues. It ignores the potential for severe consequences associated with high-priority risks, such as significant crop failure due to soil degradation or water contamination, which could have devastating economic and environmental impacts. A professional decision-making process in such a situation should involve a thorough review of the risk matrix, understanding the specific regulatory obligations associated with each identified risk, and consulting with agricultural and forestry experts. The cooperative's leadership must then develop a phased action plan that allocates resources to address high-priority risks first, ensuring compliance and long-term sustainability, while also considering the feasibility of addressing lower-priority risks as resources allow. Transparency with cooperative members about the rationale behind these decisions is also crucial. Question 15. Research into the potential for introducing a new, fast-growing crop variety into a region facing economic hardship. A local community is eager for immediate agricultural benefits. However, preliminary environmental assessments suggest this variety may have invasive characteristics and could impact local biodiversity. The university's Research Ethics Committee is reviewing the proposal, which stakeholder perspective should guide the initial research approval process, strictly adhering to the regulatory framework for the Agriculture and Forestry University Entrance Exam. Option A. The perspective of the university's Research Ethics Committee, prioritizing adherence to all relevant environmental protection laws, biodiversity conservation mandates, and sustainable land management principles as outlined in the governing regulations. Option B. The perspective of the local community, emphasizing their immediate economic needs and desire for rapid agricultural development. Option C. The perspective of individual farmers, prioritizing their immediate crop yields and ease of cultivation without broader environmental considerations. Option D. The perspective of the crop developers, focusing on the potential market success and profitability of the new variety. Correct answer is B. The perspective of the local community, emphasizing their immediate economic needs and desire for rapid agricultural development. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between the immediate economic pressures faced by a local community and the long-term sustainability goals mandated by agricultural and forestry regulations. Balancing the needs of diverse stakeholders, including farmers, foresters, local residents, and the university's research mandate, requires careful consideration of legal obligations, ethical responsibilities, and the potential environmental impact of proposed research. The correct approach involves prioritizing adherence to the established regulatory framework for agricultural and forestry research, as defined by the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exams governing laws and guidelines. This means ensuring that any research proposal undergoes rigorous review for compliance with environmental protection laws, biodiversity conservation mandates, and sustainable land management principles. The university, as a research institution, has a legal and ethical duty to conduct research that not only advances knowledge, but also upholds these critical standards. This approach is justified by the regulatory requirement to conduct research in a manner that is environmentally sound and legally compliant, preventing potential harm to ecosystems and ensuring the long-term viability of agricultural and forestry resources. An incorrect approach would be to prioritize the immediate economic benefits or the perceived urgency of the community's request without a thorough assessment of regulatory compliance. This could lead to research activities that inadvertently violate environmental protection laws, such as those governing land use, water quality, or the protection of endangered species. Another incorrect approach would be to bypass the established ethical review and approval processes for research, thereby undermining the integrity of the research and potentially exposing the university to legal repercussions. Furthermore, adopting a purely utilitarian approach that focuses solely on maximizing immediate community benefit without considering the broader regulatory and environmental implications would be a significant ethical and legal failure. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. This should be followed by a thorough risk assessment of any proposed research, considering potential environmental, social, and economic impacts. Stakeholder engagement is crucial, but it must occur within the bounds of regulatory compliance. Ultimately, decisions should be guided by a commitment to scientific integrity, environmental stewardship, and legal adherence, ensuring that research contributes positively to both the community and the broader ecosystem. Question 16. Strategic planning requires the Agriculture and Forestry University to consider a proposal for a new large-scale agroforestry project on its experimental lands. This project promises significant economic returns and job creation for the local community, but it involves clearing a portion of existing native forest. The university must decide on the most responsible path forward, considering its role as an educational institution and steward of natural resources. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical considerations for such a decision? Option A. Initiate the project with minimal environmental review, relying on existing general land use permits and deferring extensive community consultation until after initial development phases are complete. Option B. Prioritize the immediate economic benefits and job creation potential, proceeding with the project as proposed to capitalize on the opportunity, assuming that any environmental concerns can be addressed later. Option C. Implement the project based on the recommendations of the primary investors and a few key community leaders, focusing on rapid development to secure the economic advantages quickly. Option D. Conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment. Consult with local communities, indigenous groups, and relevant government agencies, and integrate findings into a revised project plan that minimizes ecological disruption and maximizes community benefit before proceeding. Correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment. Consult with local communities, indigenous groups, and relevant government agencies, and integrate findings into a revised project plan that minimizes ecological disruption and maximizes community benefit before proceeding. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic needs of a community with the long-term ecological sustainability of its agricultural and forestry resources. The university, as an institution of learning and research, has a responsibility to uphold ethical standards and adhere to the regulatory framework governing agriculture and forestry within its jurisdiction. The entrance exam's focus on this area implies a need for candidates to demonstrate an understanding of these responsibilities. The correct approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive environmental impact assessment and stakeholder consultation before committing to any new agricultural or forestry project. This aligns with the principles of sustainable development, which are increasingly embedded in regulatory frameworks for natural resource management. Specifically, it reflects the spirit of laws and guidelines that mandate responsible land use, biodiversity protection, and community engagement. By conducting thorough assessments and engaging with all affected parties, the university demonstrates a commitment to informed decision-making that respects both economic viability and environmental stewardship, as expected by the regulatory framework for such institutions. An approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term economic gains without adequate environmental consideration is ethically flawed and likely violates regulatory requirements for environmental protection and sustainable resource management. Such an approach risks irreversible ecological damage and can lead to long-term economic instability if resources are depleted. Another incorrect approach, which involves proceeding with the project based on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a select few influential individuals, bypasses the rigorous, evidence-based decision-making processes mandated by regulatory bodies. This can lead to poorly planned projects that fail to address potential negative impacts and may not achieve their intended economic benefits, while also disregarding the rights and concerns of broader stakeholder groups. Finally, an approach that delays or ignores the need for community consultation, even if environmental assessments are conducted, is also problematic. Effective stakeholder engagement is often a legal requirement and is crucial for building trust, ensuring equitable benefit sharing, and identifying potential conflicts early on. Failing to consult adequately can lead to social opposition, project delays, and reputational damage for the university. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify all relevant stakeholders and their interests. 2. Thoroughly research and understand the applicable regulatory framework, including environmental protection laws, land use regulations, and any specific guidelines for agricultural and forestry development. 3. Conduct comprehensive environmental and social impact assessments using scientific methodologies. 4. Engage in transparent and inclusive consultation with all identified stakeholders. 5. Evaluate project proposals against sustainability criteria and regulatory compliance. 6. Make decisions based on a holistic understanding of potential benefits, risks, and long-term impacts, ensuring alignment with ethical principles and legal obligations. Question 17. Comparative studies suggest that agricultural cooperatives often face pressure to maximize short-term yields. Considering the regulatory framework for the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam, which emphasizes sustainable land management and environmental protection, what is the most appropriate approach for the university's extension service when advising a cooperative seeking to increase its harvest output? Option A. Advise the cooperative to explore genetically modified crops that are known for high yields, without conducting an independent assessment of their long-term environmental impact. Option B. Recommend the immediate adoption of intensive fertilization and irrigation techniques to achieve the highest possible yield in the current season, deferring environmental considerations to future discussions. Option C. Develop and promote integrated farming systems that enhance soil fertility, conserve water, and support biodiversity, while also demonstrating economic viability for the cooperative. Option D. Focus solely on providing market access information to the cooperative, leaving all decisions regarding farming practices to the cooperative members themselves. The correct answer is C. Develop and promote integrated farming systems that enhance soil fertility, conserve water, and support biodiversity, while also demonstrating economic viability for the cooperative. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate economic interests of a farming cooperative with the long-term environmental sustainability mandated by agricultural regulations. The cooperative's members are seeking to maximize their harvest yield, which could lead to practices that deplete soil nutrients or overuse water resources. The The university's role as an advisor and researcher necessitates adherence to the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exams regulatory framework, which emphasizes sustainable land management and environmental protection alongside agricultural productivity. The correct approach involves prioritizing the development and dissemination of sustainable farming techniques that align with the regulatory framework. This approach is right because it directly addresses the core mandate of the university to promote responsible agricultural practices. By focusing on research and education that supports soil health, water conservation, and biodiversity, the university fulfills its ethical obligation to environmental stewardship and its regulatory duty to uphold sustainable land use principles. This proactive stance ensures that the cooperative's economic goals are pursued within an environmentally sound and legally compliant framework. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate yield maximization without considering environmental impact fails to adhere to the regulatory framework's sustainability requirements. This would be an ethical failure, as it disregards the long-term health of the land and the potential for future environmental degradation. Another incorrect approach that involves recommending practices that are not scientifically validated or are known to be detrimental to soil health or water resources would violate the university's commitment to evidence-based research and responsible agricultural advice. This would also represent a regulatory failure by not promoting practices that are in line with the spirit and letter of the law. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough assessment of the cooperative's needs against the backdrop of the established regulatory framework. This includes consulting relevant agricultural laws, environmental guidelines, and university research policies. Professionals should then identify solutions that offer a synergistic benefit, promoting both economic viability and ecological integrity. This often involves a consultative process with stakeholders, educating them on the long-term benefits of sustainable practices and the regulatory implications of non-compliance. Question 18. The risk matrix shows a high probability of negative environmental impacts from a proposed large-scale monoculture plantation on previously diverse agricultural land, alongside moderate economic benefits and significant concerns raised by local farming communities regarding water access and soil health. Which approach best reflects the ethical and regulatory considerations for the Agriculture and Forestry University in evaluating this proposal? Option A. Immediately reject the proposal due to the high probability of negative environmental impacts, without further investigation or consultation, to uphold the university's environmental stewardship image. Option B. Focus solely on the potential for increased agricultural output and revenue, as this directly aligns with the university's mandate to promote agricultural productivity. Option C. Prioritize the economic benefits by proceeding with the plantation, assuming that future technological advancements will mitigate environmental risks and that local concerns can be addressed through compensation. Option D. Conduct a thorough environmental impact assessment. Engage in transparent consultations with all identified stakeholders, including local communities and environmental experts, and integrate their feedback into a revised proposal that seeks to balance economic viability with ecological sustainability and community well-being. The correct answer is C. Prioritize the economic benefits by proceeding with the plantation, assuming that future technological advancements will mitigate environmental risks and that local concerns can be addressed through compensation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate economic benefits of a proposed agricultural development against potential long-term environmental and social impacts, which are often less quantifiable but critically important for sustainable forestry and agriculture. The university entrance exam for agriculture and forestry necessitates an understanding of how various stakeholders perceive and are affected by such projects, and how to ethically and legally navigate these competing interests. The correct approach involves a comprehensive stakeholder engagement process that prioritizes transparency, inclusivity, and the consideration of diverse perspectives. This aligns with the principles of sustainable development and responsible resource management, which are foundational to agricultural and forestry education. Specifically, it requires identifying all relevant stakeholders, local communities, environmental groups, government agencies, potential investors, etc. understanding their concerns and potential impacts, and integrating this feedback into the decision-making process. This approach is ethically sound, as it respects the rights and interests of all parties, and legally compliant with regulations that mandate public consultation and environmental impact assessments for significant land use changes. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing short-term economic gains without adequate consultation fails to acknowledge the potential for significant negative externalities, such as soil degradation, water pollution, or displacement of local communities. This would be a regulatory failure, as it likely violates environmental protection laws and land use planning regulations that require impact assessments and public input. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes the interests of a single dominant stakeholder group, such as large-scale investors, over the concerns of local communities or environmental advocates, represents an ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of fairness and equity, potentially leading to social conflict and undermining the long-term viability of the project and the reputation of the institution. Professionals in agriculture and forestry should employ a decision-making framework that begins with thorough risk identification and assessment, as depicted by the risk matrix. This should be followed by a systematic stakeholder analysis to understand their interests, influence, and potential impacts. Subsequently, a multi-criteria decision analysis, incorporating environmental, social, and economic factors, should be conducted. Crucially, this analysis must be informed by open and honest communication with all stakeholders, ensuring that their feedback is genuinely considered and integrated into the final recommendations or decisions. This iterative process fosters trust, promotes sustainable outcomes, and ensures compliance with relevant legal and ethical standards. Question 19. Regulatory review indicates that the Agriculture and Forestry University is considering a proposal to convert a portion of its sustainably managed forest land into a commercial blueberry farm to generate immediate revenue. The university's land management department is tasked with evaluating this proposal, which approach best aligns with the regulatory framework and ethical responsibilities for managing university-owned agricultural and forestry resources. Option A. Proceed with the conversion after a brief internal review, prioritizing the immediate revenue generation to fund other university projects. Option B. Initiate the conversion process and address any regulatory concerns that arise during or after the development phase. Option C. Immediately reject the proposal based on a general understanding that forest land should not be converted for commercial agriculture without further investigation. Option D. Commission a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, consult with relevant forestry and agricultural regulatory bodies, and engage with local community representatives to gauge potential impacts and ensure compliance with all applicable laws and sustainability guidelines before making a decision. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the conversion after a brief internal review, prioritizing the immediate revenue generation to fund other university projects. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate economic pressures and the long-term sustainability mandated by agricultural and forestry regulations. A land manager must balance the needs of various stakeholders, including the university, local communities, and the environment, while adhering to the specific legal and ethical frameworks governing agricultural and forestry practices within the exam's jurisdiction. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying these regulations to a practical situation where different interests may clash. The correct approach involves prioritizing the long-term ecological health and regulatory compliance of the land. This means conducting a thorough environmental impact assessment and consulting relevant regulatory bodies before any significant land use change. This approach is justified by the overarching principles of sustainable resource management embedded within agricultural and forestry legislation, which aim to prevent degradation, conserve biodiversity, and ensure the land's productivity for future generations. Adherence to these regulations is not merely a legal obligation, but an ethical imperative for responsible land stewardship. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the development without adequate environmental assessment or stakeholder consultation. This could lead to regulatory violations, fines, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to solely focus on the immediate financial benefits without considering the environmental consequences, which directly contravenes the principles of sustainable land management. Finally, Ignoring the concerns of local communities, even if not explicitly mandated by all regulations, represents an ethical failure in stakeholder engagement and can lead to social conflict and operational disruptions. Professionals in this field should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the full scope of applicable regulations. This is followed by a comprehensive assessment of potential environmental impacts and a proactive engagement with all relevant stakeholders. Decisions should be guided by a commitment to long-term sustainability, regulatory compliance, and ethical land stewardship, ensuring that short-term gains do not compromise the ecological integrity or legal standing of the managed land. Question 20. Consider a scenario where a prospective student applying to the Agriculture and Forestry University entrance exam is asked to advise a local farmer on improving crop yields. The farmer is eager to increase immediate profits and suggests adopting a new high-yield crop variety that requires intensive irrigation and synthetic fertilizers, but also carries a risk of introducing invasive pests to the region. What is the most appropriate advice, considering the principles likely tested in the entrance exam? Option A. Recommend a phased approach that includes soil testing, exploring drought-resistant crop alternatives, and integrating organic fertilization methods to improve soil health and minimize environmental risks, while still aiming for improved yields. Option B. Advise the farmer to adopt the new crop variety, emphasizing the potential for significantly increased yields and profits, while suggesting they monitor for pests. Option C. Advise the farmer to focus solely on maximizing irrigation and fertilizer use for the existing crops, as introducing new varieties is too complex and risky. Option D. Suggest the farmer proceed with the new crop immediately to capitalize on current market demand, as pest issues can be addressed later if they arise. The correct answer is B. Advise the farmer to adopt the new crop variety, emphasizing the potential for significantly increased yields and profits, while suggesting they monitor for pests. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between immediate economic pressures and the long-term sustainability goals mandated by agricultural and forestry regulations. The university entrance exam for agriculture and forestry likely assesses a candidate's understanding of these dual responsibilities. A candidate must demonstrate an awareness that short-term gains cannot come at the expense of environmental stewardship or compliance with established land management practices. The correct approach involves prioritizing the long-term ecological health and regulatory compliance of the agricultural land. This aligns with the core principles of sustainable agriculture and forestry, which are fundamental to the curriculum and likely reflected in the entrance exam's regulatory framework. Specifically, regulations governing land use, soil conservation, water management, and biodiversity protection would necessitate a cautious approach that avoids practices detrimental to the environment, even if they offer immediate financial benefits. Adhering to these principles ensures the land's productivity for future generations and avoids potential legal repercussions or reputational damage. An approach that focuses solely on maximizing immediate crop yield without considering the impact on soil fertility or water resources fails to acknowledge the regulatory framework that likely mandates sustainable farming practices. This could lead to soil degradation, water pollution, and non-compliance with environmental protection laws. Similarly, an approach that prioritizes rapid timber harvesting without adhering to reforestation plans or sustainable forestry guidelines would violate regulations designed to ensure the long-term health of forest ecosystems and their economic viability. Finally, an approach that ignores the potential for invasive species introduction through the import of new crops or livestock, without proper quarantine or risk assessment, would contraindicate regulations aimed at protecting native biodiversity and agricultural integrity. Professional decision-making in such situations requires a thorough understanding of the relevant agricultural and forestry laws, an assessment of the environmental impact of proposed actions, and a commitment to ethical land stewardship. Candidates should be able to weigh short-term economic incentives against long-term ecological and regulatory obligations, demonstrating a holistic understanding of responsible land management.